Good afternoon. My name is Peter Hurst, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. Our network, which includes our council, 22 other regional councils, and the National Minority Supplier Development Council, is focused on economic inclusion and minority business development. The first 6 months of 2020 have laid bare what we already knew. We have a racial wealth gap in America. The median net worth of a white family is 10 times that of a black family, 9 times that of a Hispanic family. Wealth affects where you live, the quality of schools your children attend, whether you can buy a home, whether you can get proper health care, whether you can impact the political process, and whether you have the resources to start and grow a business. Minority-owned businesses are critically important because they generate economic output. They create and maintain jobs, especially with people of color. They generate incremental tax revenue, and they create a cadre of servant leaders. Despite this, across America, the PPP loan program literally flew right over the minority business community. More generally, minority-owned businesses find it difficult to obtain all types of capital, but there's a special issue in them trying to find equity and mezzanine funding from venture capital sources, private equity funds, and angel investors. So today, we're starting our Access to Capital series with a conversation that I know will lead to structural change, and it can do so with the urgency that this moment deserves. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Goldberg, the Treasurer and Receiver General for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Sean Wood, the Treasurer for the state of Connecticut. These two state treasurers control a lot of money. Collectively, they oversee over $120 billion. Today, they're going to share with us their perspectives on some very important questions, including how can more capital be allocated to private equity funds and venture capital funds managed by diverse managers? How can minority-owned businesses get greater access to equity and mezzanine capital, which can fuel their growth? And how can large and powerful shareholders like these two treasurers use their leverage and influence to have a positive impact on the policies and practices of Wall Street and corporate America, especially in the areas of economic inclusion, diversity and inclusion, and minority business and development? Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Treasurer Goldberg and Treasurer Wooden. Deborah B. Goldberg is the Massachusetts State Treasurer and Receiver General. In that role, she is responsible for the state's cash and debt management, unclaimed property, and she chairs state boards and commissions, including the Massachusetts School Building Authority, the Pension Reserves Investment Management Board, the State Board of Retirement, the Massachusetts State Lottery Commission, and the Massachusetts Clean Water Trust. In 2015, Treasurer Goldberg established the new Office of Economic Empowerment, the first of its kind in the country, and chairs its Economic Empowerment Trust Fund. She also was elected to serve as the president of the National Association of State Treasurers. As a former businesswoman and local elected leader, Treasurer Goldberg brings innovative leadership, disciplined financial management, and an unwavering commitment to uphold economic stability and create opportunity for every Massachusetts resident. She served for 6 years on the Brookline Board of Selectmen, including 2 as its chair. And prior to her career in public service, she worked in retail operations, buying and consumer affairs at the Stop and Shop companies. She's a graduate of Boston University, the Boston College Law School, and Harvard Business School. She lives in Brookline with her husband, Michael Winter, and their son, Evan, and daughter, Meredith. Welcome, Treasurer Goldberg. Sean T. Wooden was sworn in as Connecticut's 83rd State Treasurer on January 9, 2018. He previously spent 21 years as an investment attorney focused on public pension plans. Born and raised in Hartford, Treasurer Wooden graduated from Trinity College and worked in key roles for the Mayor of Hartford and the State Commission of Social Services. He's the former president of the Hartford City Council and the Connecticut State Director of Project Vote. He also served on Connecticut Citizens Ethics Advisory Board, overseeing the Connecticut Office of State Ethics. Treasurer Wooden holds a JD from NYU School of Law and worked in the AFCIO's Office of Investment in Washington, D.C. He was recognized as a Connecticut super lawyer for securities and corporate finance, business, and corporate. Pensions and Investments named him one of the 25 investment professionals to watch, and Savoy magazine identified him as one of the most influential Black lawyers in the country. Treasurer Wooden is the father of 2 teenage sons, and we are really welcoming you and happy to have you here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Treasurer Goldberg and Treasurer Wooden. I'd like to start off. Both of these leaders have articulated and taken positions throughout their terms in office which have benefited everyone and really focused on the goals of economic inclusion. But I'd like to start off by, focusing on, access to capital for equity and mezzanine finance, because that's the more patient form of capital that's needed. And unlike bank financing, where, one is, and I'm a former banker, so I know how this works. When banks are making credit decisions, they're really looking at the company and looking at the historical results of the company, the strength of the balance sheet, and making a credit decision. When private equity funds and venture funds look at investing in companies, they're really betting on the jockey rather than the horse. So when those making those investment decisions look different from the folks before them trying to get money, it makes it difficult for them to be successful. So one easy solution, we have a number of minority-led private equity funds and venture funds. That number. Treasurer Wooden, would you like to start with that?
I just want to give you guys a heads up. You completely froze. I don't know why. Sean, did you hear the question? I didn't.
No. So if you could repeat the question, Peter, and then I'll let you know if I want to answer it.
Okay. That's fair enough. So the question is, what can we do, not we, but really you and Treasurer Goldberg, to increase the amount of funds that are managed by people of color, especially private equity funds and venture capital funds?
All right, we're prepped for that.
Thank you, Peter. First, let me say that I think this is great that you and the organization that you have launched this webinar series. Thank you for your leadership in this space, and I think you can continue to play an active role around advocacy and information for those of us who sit in these seats as treasurers and other elected officials as we shape policy and allocate capital. So thank you for your role in that. With respect to your question, I think it's important to note just foundationally as an investor, we look at things like risk management, fiduciary duties. We look over the long term. You spoke of patient capital and how to generate returns for our beneficiaries over a long period of time. We look at issues such as diversifying our portfolio. All of these issues is the framework with which I approach the issue of diverse asset managers. And I think it undermines our ability to be good stewards of capital when we don't have a diversity of managers in terms of thought, strategies, ideas, right? And that includes people of color, women managing assets. There are studies, a number of studies now, that show the value of diversity in terms of increasing the performance of companies and strategies. We have had a significant increase in the number of, just speaking of venture capital, in the number of diverse venture capital firms that have been launched over the last decade, a significant increase. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a sufficient corresponding increase in the amount of capital that's allocated there. So I think treasurers in particular and others should play a leadership role in making the case for diversity in the asset management industry. And in addition to making the case, taking actions, concrete steps towards making those allocation decisions. And as Deb, I'm sure we'll get into, we all have different structures in terms of how we operate. In Connecticut, I'm a sole trustee for our pension system. And so that gives some greater flexibility in certain areas for me to act. With respect to the state of Connecticut, we've had a long history and legacy of supporting and promoting the use of diverse asset managers in all asset classes. That is a legacy that I am stepping into and continuing to promote and trying to do more and do better. So that comes in a few forms. One, we have an emerging managers program where we specifically, we have, one of the premier diverse fund of funds managers in the country in Fairview Capital, managing a pool of capital for us that's designed to find the best in class venture capital firms, including diverse managers. And so we have a programmatic emerging managers program. We also utilize Muller Monroe for that, based out of Chicago, for that role as well. In addition to that, we also require that every asset management firm that does business with the state, that they provide as part of the due diligence process information on the diversity within their organization. And that's something that I see prior to making an investment decision. And that has formed the basis and created the space along that diligence process to encourage the firms that are, let's say, need a little nudge in the area of diversity. And I pride myself on having very candid conversations about that with firm leaders, because I truly believe in the value of ESG, and in which I see diversity and inclusion as a subset of that. And I don't believe that you can produce the best results for our pension beneficiaries if you lack diversity in your firms. And so, we'll talk more about that, but those are some of the ways. But I think we have to be leaders, and not just in our talk, but in terms of when we make these allocation decisions, it has to be demonstrable.
So Treasurer Goldberg.
So, Treasurer Wooden, who I hope you don't mind, having been a grocer my whole life, I actually refer to people by their first name, and he and I are very good friends. And so I call him Sean and he calls me Deb. So that's a comfort zone. And since this is a fireside chat, I hope you'll be okay with that. So Sean's role is entirely different than mine. The structure in Massachusetts, surprisingly to me, as I delved into it, is extremely restrictive in terms of the kind of power that I exercise over the pension fund. We have 9 members of a board, and only one is appointed by me. I sit as chair. The sole person that I appointed, as I mentioned to you prior to us going live, is a woman who was the first African-American woman who was a bond counsel with a white shoe law firm in Boston. And the statute that informed how the board is made up, at one point they did add that there needed to be 2 members of the board of color. And so there presently are. However, the governor has greater appointing power, and then there are elected members from constituencies, public safety, the retirement systems, and the teachers have 2. And so we have a very strong chief investment officer who's also holds 2 roles, the executive director, and consequently, they and the policies that were created prior to my arrival control a great deal of the investment decisions. What I've tried to do is through, when I arrived, I'll just describe to you my first day prior to my being sworn in. And I shared with you also that my transition team was, the chairs were 3 out of 4 of the chairs were African American. And in all of my hiring practices coming in, we had, people knew I was going to be the real deal. And as I tried to explain to people who are at the pension fund and at different areas in state government, if people know you're the real deal, there are an awful lot of qualified people out there that are going to apply. But people don't want to be a token, and they don't want to just be stuck in as the diversity officer. Come on. So we were known to be the real deal. Our transition teams reflected that. It was a United Nations and really warmed my heart because I was able to achieve what I was seeking to achieve. But the pension fund was a shock. I walked into my first meeting. There were 65 people in the room. I was one of 3 women. I looked at a lot of gray suits and blue ties, and there was no one of color. And my first deputy looked at my face and he knew exactly what I was thinking. So when we were having a private meeting, I said, this has to change. And if you don't know how to do it, I'm going to help you understand how to do it. And so that just began internally. And even to this day, if you go shoot and look at staff, it's white men, which is extremely offensive to me. Now, the good news is, and one of the appointees, not mine, has objected to the fact that I have put so much pressure on the executive director to diversify all the ranks within the pension fund. He thinks it's a waste of their time. Their focus should solely be what his definition is of fiduciary duty. So this is the internal battle that I'm fighting, but I'm winning on that front. If you start looking at all the different levels leading up, we should have some tremendous people, women of color, men of color, all rising. Simultaneously, I walked in, and the proxy voting guideline of my predecessor was we invest in 11,000 companies. 1 person of color or 1 woman. I went, great, Benny Wiley, my dear friend, your friend Peter, she fits it. They probably put her on the, good for Benny, but not good for the rest of the world. I immediately changed it to 25%. Now this, I had to get through the admin and audit committee. I didn't have that one person who thinks it's solely fiduciary duty. He didn't arrive for a couple of years. So I got that done. We moved to 25%, we've moved to 30%. I have been speaking publicly on the importance both at the National Association, and that is a bipartisan group, and not everyone agrees with me, as Sean will tell you, and I very specifically asked Sean to run for treasurer of that group because I want the legacy of the work I've done to be carried on as I move out of there, and then I'm going to be helping and coaching from behind too. We have been setting the stage for, if people only want to think about profit, they can then understand that the data will all point to, if your workforce is more diverse, if your board is more diverse, if who you invest in is more diverse, it results in dollars. So I present it as an economic imperative in today's world. And right down to, we have an adjunct group called the National Institute of Public Finance. I won't go into a full description of what that group looked like when I arrived, but I will tell you I almost never went back. And now as president of NAS, I helped to set the stage for the next one. And I am going to require our corporate affiliates that if they want to participate, you have to understand they want access to the treasurers and their staffs, that they need to be sending women and people of color, period. And otherwise, I'm not going to be so excited about them coming. Now, I believe in smiling and not using a stick, so I have to really make this positive for them. Now, in terms of actual investment, I had been pushing and pushing and pushing that we increase our investments with Black owned and minority owned. And I'm going to tell you, I've included women and people with disabilities in that group because these are all underrepresented groups and they all deserve an opportunity. And my success has, I had them send me the numbers today. It's improved. And however, I also got to the point of frustration where I would bring some very quality people in. However, they did not fit our investment requirements. A track record together of success. See, that's a barrier.
Right.
Because if you take several people who've already been in a firm or they've been in different firms and they've had great track records and they go, why am I making all this money and I'm not getting the percentage of the results because I'm being discriminated against internally, and that happens to women and people of color of all colors all the time. Why don't I find 2 other very smart people like me and start a firm? Then that ends up 0 track record. So I was bringing a lot of people in and they weren't getting invested with. So I finally figured out a workaround, and it was to take a small pool of resources that had been designated back in 2006 called economically targeted investments. However, they were only $500,000, $500,000, way too little in today's world. And I had filed a bill in this past session to convert those to be able to invest with women, people with disabilities, and African American firms. Because I was trying I was trying to get my nose under the tent and not draw attention to the bill that would then stop it. So the entire movement that's now occurring, and this is news that I was able to share with Sean 2 days ago, is a police reform bill has been filed in the Senate. It was filed yesterday, and there's an equity piece in it. And I adopted the language that mainly came from Illinois in 2015, which requires the pension fund to invest 20% of the monies under management with Black-owned, women, and disability-owned firms. It was filed, was it Tuesday? It was, sorry, today's Thursday at 4 p.m. And I've already talked to someone in the House to see if, and I'm sending her the language in case it doesn't move right now, but this would do it. And what I'm going to ask all of you, and we can talk offline after this event, on developing a coalition here in Massachusetts that will be pushing for this. Now I'm meeting with Sagoon also, who I'm sure you know, and because we're also focusing on underwriters and bond counsels. These are the things that treasurers control. I know there's a whole program on other things that the executive branch controls, and I support them completely. And if you look at my appointees, you'll see if you look at my staff, I have the most diverse staff ever in the history of state government. And in my last campaign, the Globe said, how do you know? And I said, because we accumulate the data on a quarterly basis and check it all the time. And they said, who accumulates that? And I said, my head of human resources, a woman, Sui Lin Wong. And she went, oh, okay. And I said, Commonwealth Magazine wrote about it. So, you know, I always tell people, you got to start where you live, and then you can go out and place demands on the rest of the world. So I am going to ask your help, among others, in lobbying state senators, state representatives, leadership on how critical this bill is going to be in leveling the playing field. The other kind of quick things that I've done is we have a small business banking partnership under the Treasurer's office where we'll we will place deposits with banks that if they will loan those resources to Black and minority and women-owned firms, a lot of immigrants. We do it a lot in Brockton and other major immigrant cities. And we have created during COVID a grant program for those business people that you mentioned that were where there was a flyover in terms of the kind of monies that came in from the federal government. So those are some of my workarounds on this because of the restraints that I have, because of all pushed by my commitment to the purposes that we all seek. And I have a ton of other things from the Office of Economic Empowerment, but I don't want to take up this time because we are focused on this. Like my baby steps college savings plan, which I'm sure you know about. And if you don't, and you have a pending grandchild, we'll talk offline on that too.
So thank you for that, Treasurer Goldberg. Treasurer Wooden, couple of things. One, I just wanted to let you know in terms of the work that Fairview Capital has done is extraordinary. And we have a private equity panel coming up, and Larry Morris is going to be one of the participants on that panel. So I just wanted to let you know that will be showcased. But I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned about you're having these conversations with your asset managers about how diverse are their organizations. There's a difference between diversity at the lower levels and diversity amongst leadership, because is evidenced by the work that the two of you are doing. Leadership matters. So in terms of diversity with your asset managers, how high up are you requiring them to push it?
Well, I'm looking at everything, and the reporting that's required from them breaks it down by executive, most senior level, mid-level managers, and then organization wide. So I have transparency both in terms of gender diversity by all of those categories, as well as racial ethnic diversity. And we're encouraging diversity at all levels, including which I definitely want to talk about before we leave in my corporate call to action, including board level, right? So it's throughout the organization, and senior level leadership is critically important. And we also have to be very, very mindful of pipeline development. And we should talk about that, because part of the breakdowns, whether it's diversity and rise of leadership within organizations and expertise, or development of more diverse firms, gets to the pipeline, and whether a pipeline is being developed, nurtured, cared for, such as pipelines that are created typically for majority executives.
So one of the things that I know you've dealt with in your long career as a lawyer, and Treasurer Goldberg has dealt with it, you do have these fiduciary responsibilities. So diversity is the goal, but you still have those responsibilities. And I've seen, reports from the National Association of Investment Companies, from Fairview Capital, that minority managers in the venture capital and private equity field actually outperform their non-minority counterparts. Is that consistent with what you've been seeing?
Certainly, all of our, and I don't know if there's an exception in here, but by and large, first and second quartile performers. I will not sacrifice quality and returns and performance as a fiduciary for this, but it's quite the contrary. I think increasingly, when these conversations were being had 15, 20 years ago, I think it was much harder, or I know it was, to talk about the correlation between kind of performance results data. We have so much data now on this kind of empirically, as a state, but there are academic papers on this. There are fund of funds managers who produce information and aggregate results, that I see it as not only consistent with being a good fiduciary, I see it as required. The other thing, irrespective of race, but there is a correlation between emerging managers and diverse managers oftentimes, is that you want to identify, particularly in the venture capital, private equity, you want to identify the next generation of top performers. And so there are sweet spots with superstars often coming out of traditional large shops, right, who've kind of built careers and have gone on to launch their own products, and being able to get in to the next generation of high performers while there's still capacity in funds, particularly in the venture capital space. Unfortunately, we know from the data that there is a difference between the high performers that come out of some of the traditional big name institutions and when they go to launch and how they are treated by allocators. We know that race is a differentiator in a negative way. That's not, you can't explain it away just based on prior performance track record in these institutions, because they're going to the same schools. Now, going into, as analysts working their way up, either as investment bankers, investors in these institutions, and there's still a disparity gap. And that is what those of us on the allocation side, what we need to look at, what we need to call out, what we need to address systemically in our own shops.
Thank you. So, Treasurer Goldberg, until this bill is enacted, we will certainly, stand by your side and help push the legislature to enact this bill you just mentioned. But what can we do to help you now with Governor Baker and anyone else? What can we do?
Well, firstly, I just also want to make some comments on investment strategies, which also restrict our pension fund, for example. We do not invest with any fund of funds. So that's one challenge, because Sean, one of your strategies is to work with the funds of funds to do this. And we do only we are separately managed funds, and then it's sizing. A lot of the venture capital funds cannot give us the sizing that is part of our investment strategy, which you alluded to, Sean, in when you were looking at that, which is because of the size of our fund. And so, however, that is why this piece this legislative piece is so critical. I have worked with a gentleman out of Philadelphia named John Ferguson. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He is one of the top experts on what places restraints on pension funds and what is definition of fiduciary duty and what is definition of ESG, and it's different in every single state. The challenge here, and this is not an excuse, is the legislature has saved it for themselves to make those decisions. And he has explained to me that those are the guardrails. And so the kind of things I'm able to do at this time are the subtle things that I have done. Putting internal pressure on directly with the CIO, executive director. I have directed all my department heads, which he is one of each and every one of them coming up with action items for in the equity space of what we can do now. So when I asked him to pull together the data of where we are, I have said to him, on a voluntary basis, you have to be doing more to push the firms that we are looking at to, whether it's a consultant, because we do utilize consultants to find firms to invest with, to be seeking out and finding those firms and us considering taking bigger positions or smaller positions if that's all that's available to us. However, all of that has to go through the investment committee, and that's sometimes where I can get bogged down. That's why this legislation changes the entire paradigm. And that's why offline, whether it is all of the groups locally here in Massachusetts, need to coalesce around these kind of initiatives, because it can, as you read in the Boston Business Journal or in the Boston Globe or in Commonwealth Magazine, the Senate and the House can get into their banging heads, and it could all go up and disappear in the ether. The moment is now. Sean and I have been talking about that consistently. And in fact, his op-ed piece that he did has gotten traction in Massachusetts because it was so powerful. And then the last thing that we really need to be concerned about, and this is why everybody has to be pushing, and I don't want to make this political, but the Trump administration is trying to cut back on what pension funds can invest in. They have tried to reverse the gains that we got under Obama, and they have been issuing opinions, and they may try to do something even more so before November. And consequently, elections have consequences. And so one of the consequences is we may be able to do a great deal. However, we are also swimming upstream in terms of fighting the Trump administration on this. And also, in my case, we do need the legislature. And the way in which they've reserved it for themselves is by having already spoken. I've been asked 100 million times to divest from fossil fuels. I am not allowed to do that. I filed a request to divest from guns. It has never passed. Isn't that a no-brainer? So I need your help. That's the bottom line. I need your help. And I'm really serious about it. I'm hung up with a member of the House today, and even if the Senate bill dissipates, I want to get a House member to file their version of the same thing. And if we can get both sides and we seize the moment and we get people really, really, really pushing their state representatives and their state senators, that's the chance we have.
Thank you. So you got it. You have our pledge to help. And
you don't know what that means, though. It means you get calls from me on Saturdays and
that's fine.
Evenings, and
my staff will tell you I'm up early and stay up late, and it doesn't stop on Saturday and Sunday.
Hey, that's a deal.
So let me just switch gears to something that's very, very targeted. If you look at the whole minority business community, there's a misconception that it's a lot of small and struggling companies, and that's certainly part of the reality. But just to set the table for my question, here in New England, we've certified about 230 or so minority-owned businesses, which is a small subset of the total pool of those with employees. Those 230 or so have GDP contributions of like 4.3 billion. They employ 20,000 people, and of the 20,000, 65% are people of color. And as I said, we're part of a national network. National network is certified about 12,000. So their GDP contribution is probably over $500 billion. Given those statistics and that framework, is there any appetite from what you see with public pension funds to have private equity funds and venture funds that are targeted specifically at minority-owned businesses?
Sean?
So I will note, I don't know if there's appetite in terms of that type of targeting. But what I will note, and there are studies on this, is that there is a correlation between increasing the allocations to diverse managers. And without that targeting that you're speaking of, one study that comes to mind, the entire allocation to a manager, then you look at all their portfolio companies, And in one case, I believe it was 57% of the portfolio company investments from that, either private equity fund, let's call it, we actually put into the hands of companies with Black executives. And what the takeaway from this analysis is that part of the value proposition towards increasing those allocations is that you're getting a differentiated opportunity set. And those diverse managers are using their diverse in different networks from other managers. And so their mission is to make money in a return. So they're not doing philanthropy or grant making at their level, because they're not going to get further investment. So they've got a return, and if it's a mezzanine or some sort of debt investment, they got to pay that back, right? So they're not identifying these companies based on the race, but they are seeing the additional opportunities that are going overlooked in a serious and systemic way in our country. And so it just validates the work that we need to do as allocators to get more capital into the hands of diverse managers, because that's going to create more opportunity for us. Going back to my original argument and underpinning, and what Deb said as well, is that there is a strong economic and fiduciary underpinning to the notion that we should allocate more to diverse managers.
And to lead on with that, we don't invest in any businesses directly either. Again, we do today exactly how Sean described it, and the philosophy and theory that he's putting out there is exactly the reason why I need to get the ball rolling. It's through the grant programs and the other programs that I've done internally at Treasury that I've been able to invest directly in minority-owned businesses. And that I created that in order to have that avenue, because the pension fund that's not their mission. And so that is exactly what I'm hoping to achieve by this bill. Is critical. I mean, I can't emphasize that. I mean, Sean was so excited when I told him I actually found a vehicle on Tuesday and filed it, because he and I had talked about this on Monday, and then boom, it happened. So he was like, gave me a standing ovation on that one. Right? Yeah, you couldn't believe that we were able to do that fast. So
and that's the thing with all of these different states, and it's funny. My first meeting, I think it was a webinar as a state treasurer. They say when you've seen one state treasurer's office, you've seen one state treasurer's office, because we all have kind of different tweaks in requirements. And in Deb's case, it's incumbent. The legislature, basically, they have handcuffs on the range of opportunities. And even in Deb, and I got to say, I understand those in the investment community who may want to shy away from fund of funds, the double layer of fees and so forth. But it is actually, and when we talk about looking at structural impediments to opportunities, when you take a step back from it and you see diverse managers with smaller fund sizes, right? We're trying to get off the ground, great track records, but it is a structural and systemic way of keeping a barrier. There is a good reason in terms of our requirements, and I have the same requirements in terms of concentration limits with a manager. Right. But if I did not have programs created that could, that I could allocate enough to a fund of funds to meet those concentration limits, and that they could target, right? So it's systemically cutting out a segment of opportunity for Massachusetts that has a disproportionately negative impact, right?
That, and it's a legacy that was there when I arrived as part of Project Save. There was a huge endorsed by the board and administration and audit on Project Save and goals of monies that they had to save in the X amount of years moving forward. And so that is why I think if the bill passes, then they're going to have to sit down and say, okay, how do we reach those goals? And this may be one of the ways in which they have to adjust adjust their thinking because of that fact. So yeah. I totally understand that. I think that if you have the goal right in front of them and it's required to reach the goal, it's going to have to cause some rethinking about investment strategy too.
That's right. And Peter.
And we haven't officially done any ESG investing either because of limitation. We're doing a study on it, but because of there's so much going on swirling around about even definition of ESG.
Yeah, and as you probably know, BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset managers, they now do everything, all of their investments, through an analysis and prism of ESG. And that's how strongly they feel that ESG is about value creation. So maybe that's another webinar, Peter, but
so let's schedule it now.
Yes. But I wanted to note, Deb made reference to my op-ed in this call to action, because another critical way that we as treasurers can play a role in advancing the ball is engaging, encouraging, leaning on corporate America to play a constructive role in fighting systemic racism, bias, in creating opportunity. And so my call to action was basically saying, hey, as a treasurer, I know the power that you hold in society. We have a front row seat to Wall Street, and it's time for so many reasons at this critical juncture in our country's history, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of facing our epidemic, that's 400 years plus in the making around race, that now is the time for corporate America to engage in a robust, serious way of being a constructive force. I remind them that in terms of changing the course of South Africa, it was corporate America that played a very constructive role with the economic boycott. More recently, we jump ahead and we look at Mississippi with changing the flag. That was about economic power and influence as much as anything else. And so this is another avenue. And I've said, corporate America, I want you to do two things. I want you to look in the mirror and answer the question, what do we look like and how can we do better, be better inside? And I want you to look out your windows and say, the communities in which we operate, in which our employees come from, in which our customer base is located, how can we impact that in a positive way? And in particular, as it relates to economic disparities and closing that gap. There's a McKinsey study that shows that if we close the economic disparity gap by 2028, we can increase GDP in our country by 4 to 6%. That's no small number, right? But rooting it in that, as a shareholder in these corporations, we see looking at these issues about long-term value preservation and creation and sustaining that value. And so, this is very much rooted now in the economics of these corporations and of our society more generally. And I'll close on this point. Goldman Sachs, an economist, has gone on record saying if we don't address systemic racism, we will undermine our economy and our financial markets. And so this is powerful stuff and a rationale that because it's the right thing to do from a moral imperative perspective, if that's not enough, then do it because it's the right economic thing to do. And this includes, as it relates to access to capital, that's like one of the things at the top of my list in my conversations with CEOs, is how you can increase access to capital for businesses, how you can diversify your supply chain pipeline. And so there are lots of things that can be done, and there are lots of ways that us in the public space as treasurers can engage with that community that advances your organization's mission, Peter.
So thank you. So Treasurer Wooden, if I could quickly share with the audience a couple of passages from this op-ed, and it was titled "Corporate America, It's Time to Stand Up Against Racism." There are two things you said that were, everything you said was powerful, but there were two things that really stood out. You said, "It is time for the wealthy and privileged to start pulling the levers of power they hold. Wall Street and corporate America, I'm speaking to you. There is precedent for corporate America playing a constructive role in advancing social change." And then the second passage, which I want just everyone to hear, says, as a state treasurer overseeing more than 60 billion, I am well aware of the power of capital in America. So to Wall Street and businesses across America, hear us. We want to live, and we need you to get off the sidelines. Joining with advocates, you have the power and the resources to change the trajectory of this country. So I just wanted to, take a few minutes and share it. I'm going to share this op-ed with all of our stakeholders. We sent out a newsletter every 2 weeks to 9,500 because it was very powerful. And I think corporate America, Wall Street needs to hear it. They need to take advantage of it, because I think a lot of times we look to the public sector as the only source of change. But corporate America and Wall Street, the private sector, can affect change immediately with a speed and a velocity that is structural because it's in their self-interest. So I really appreciate the message you sent, because again, if you look at our organization, 45 years ago, there was a focus on supplier diversity because it was a quote unquote, right thing to do. Now there's a focus on it because minority business development makes communities stronger through the economic output, through the job creation and maintenance, through the incremental tax revenue, to the creation of a cadre of servant leaders. So it is really the right thing to do for every CEO, every CFO, every board that's trying to increase market share. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I will note that the response from corporate CEOs has been very, very positive. And I've had several conversations with an interest to do something, because my major point is, don't just make statements, right? We've got plenty of statements. We need to see tangible efforts, and those efforts, if we're really going to get at it, right? It's not a 10-month project. It's a 10-year commitment to rolling up our sleeves and drilling down on these systemic issues. And as a treasurer, so I highlight, housing disparities, education disparities, all of these. As a treasurer, I feel like a good place for me and Deb to be is in the area of saying, let's focus like a laser beam on economic disparities and creating economic opportunities for our respective states and this nation.
You see, what is interesting is that Sean and I care about a lot of things that are not directly under our control. However, our ability to be looked at as a thought leader on economic issues allows us to broaden our portfolio on the things that we comment upon, because they think the world perceives us as all things money oriented. And so one of the things that I've taken advantage of, and I don't mean advantage in a bad way, I mean in a good way, since I arrived, was utilizing that thought process and expanding the roles within my treasurer's office of the things that I could influence. And Sean is doing the same. And I mean, how long have we been talking about the Confederate flag, for example? But when Daytona and NASCAR jumped in, boom. So that's why understanding the power of corporate America is critical. Part of corporate America is pushing against us doing those things, but part of corporate America is saying, gee, it's in my economic interest to embrace these issues. And that's where Sean's call to action and the work we're doing together is to reach out and begin to build the allies. And one of the things that I say to groups that I speak to, whether it's an African American group or women, is we need allies who are in power today. And that means frequently white men. So it is
every day, white men.
So
and they exist. And the good news is they exist.
Right. And
in terms of allies.
So we need to embrace our allies. And in many cases, all they require is further education. They're open, but they need further education. And that's part of some initiatives that Sean and I are also working on together on outreaching. And we're engaging many other treasurers in that.
So if the folks could see me now, I'm actually grinning from ear to ear, because my theory has always been is that while we certainly want to push the public sector to do more in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of minority business development, they should, because it's an important part of the economy, but the private sector is immensely larger.
Yeah.
And I really have always believed that a missed opportunity is not having folks in the public sector using their bully pulpit to tell the private sector, you need to wake up because this is in your self-interest. So I really appreciate this message from both of you.
Thank you.
So we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. I wanted to see if there's anyone in the audience had any questions that they wanted me to pass on to either Treasurer Goldberg or Treasurer Wooden.
There are currently none listed.
Okay.
Does that mean we were so good or we put people to sleep?
I don't think you put anyone
I thought
to
for
sleep.
sure we were going to get a question on, did we coordinate on wearing blue today? I just knew that was coming.
And the white shirts and white blouses.
Thank you for allowing me to be identified as wearing a blouse.
So I'll ask this final question. Obviously, you know, the well-publicized disparity of COVID-19 on people of color is known. We've seen, you know, the impact of police brutality against African American men, but we know it also occurs with you know, Latin Americans and Native Americans. And there's certainly a lot of, you know, focus. I've read more statements the last few months than that, you know, folks are, you know, focused on these issues and want to do better. But I'm concerned that this moment will pass. How do we use this moment to make sure that there's real structural change so that we truly have economic inclusion? Because economic inclusion, you know, leads to better housing, better healthcare, better education. It leads to all of the things that are important to us as a society.
Well, I believe that we need to be acting quickly. And I think that Sean feels exactly the same way. We can't let this moment pass. And candidly, COVID isn't going to go away tomorrow. So I think the turmoil is going to continue. I hate to come back and say, again, elections matter, but they do. And were we to have someone else in the White House, we would have an ally on these issues. We have been pushing the economic issues on the side of the non-incumbent and expanding their understanding of many things that can be done. But I think that is why I'm so fierce in saying, I filed the bill. I want to get you engaged. I'm identifying someone in the House that will carry it. we need to begin to get some of these things through so that, for example, treasurers who are not fiduciaries, and there are a lot of them, have the ability to find an avenue for themselves. That's in our space, but also working on the issues of the call to action with corporate America. And corporate America, the allies need to be able to continue to feel empowered and not shut down upon by those who would seek to do so. And so this means acting fast and being nimble. And yes, I have concern about the slowness of how some things move in state legislatures. But I also think that some of them are seeking solutions too and just don't know how to do them. And so for us to be able to provide the roadmap of how they get there in ways in which are pretty straightforward is really critical. And that's what Sean and I can do in our space. What I can do is say to our pension fund, should the bill pass, well, this is what Treasurer Wooden does. He can come up to Massachusetts. He can make a presentation to our group. These are the strategies I use, and that kind of thing. So we already have a collaboration in place, and now we just need to get others involved and then keep things moving. And in fact, even if before you ask what can happen before, Treasurer Wooden can still come to Massachusetts and speak to our pension fund even before a bill passes. We typically have a retreat in September, and he can be one of the guest speakers. We're still going to do it on Zoom. So
Treasurers Goldberg and Wooden. This is Keith Greenaway, who was Peter's colleague at the council. I just want to let you know that I think people weren't aware that they could actually ask questions because they started to flood in, and comments just started to pour in. First of all, we got a number that actually said that this has been very informative, and folks are very heartened to see how, two treasurers from two neighboring states can sort of collaborate and develop enough of a relationship to hopefully leverage to actually make lasting change. One person asked a question about, he asked a question about funding startups, which we will answer that question ourselves internally. But the other question has to do with an RFP process. There is, was there something that was mentioned about an RFP and how some of these companies can get involved or can see those?
I can answer that for Massachusetts. We do have an RFP process for things like underwriters and bond counsels. However, we have a bench, and even prior to my arriving, we do have a group of Black-owned law firms, underwriters who are on our bench who who are selected to be part of deals. So that has occurred already. But also, when we do go out for deals, then there's also a bidding process, which I'm sure, Sean, you go through also on who gives the Commonwealth or the state of Connecticut, where we're going to make the most amount of money on the deals. But we do give pieces of underwriting. We award them, and we do include minority firms. In terms of RFP process and public procurement laws in general, in terms of what the state purchases, again, there is legislation that was passed, and I can't tell you when, whether it was under Deval Patrick or prior to then, that does give a point preference to a minority-owned firm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So Treasurer Wooden, we're out of time, but I do want to let you have the last word on what we can do to seize the moment and really affect structural change.
Yeah, so our country is divided right now, particularly in the African-American community, between the cynics and those who have hope, right? And the cynics have history on their side, but I'm one of those with hope, and I do believe that this moment is different. I believe that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of watching George Floyd's killing on video for the nation, with everyone at home watching it repeatedly because of the pandemic, I think it is our modern day Emmett Till moment in America, where so many Americans' eyes have been opened, and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. So I do believe that this moment is different. And I believe this is the best opportunity, certainly that I will have in my lifetime, to play a role in our nation leapfrogging in terms of steps to address systemic racism. There was a time when, as a politician, you couldn't even get those words out of people's mouths to talk about systemic racism. You can now. When you look at the Gallup poll, just 5-6 years ago, on a poll on whether it's Black Lives Matter or police reform, maybe it was 40% of the country believed that it was important or it was a problem or that they supported the Black Lives Matter movement. It's now 70%, and that includes a majority of Republicans at around 51, 52%. All of that, it's the biggest shift in public opinion in the history of Gallup polling. So that all supports the notion that this moment is different. The real question is that, are we going to be able to mobilize, to put in the work, to focus enough to make it meaningful? We have people who want to see change, including people in power. You know, I have talked to many CEOs, right? So the real question is, how do we translate this into sustainable, tangible results that are impactful? There'll be a lot of activity right now. We've got to make it activity that counts.
I have one thing to say. Hear, hear.
So let me close by thanking Treasurer Goldberg, Treasurer Wooden, not only for sharing your perspectives today, but what you do in terms of allocating capital and what you do in terms of influence and behavior in your role as shareholders. As I indicated at the start, this is the first of our capital access series. We're going to have a panel on private equity, another panel on venture capital, one on SBICs, one on CDFIs, and then a panel with banks. But this really set the tone, set the table, and I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing your perspectives with us today, and thank you for the work you do.
Well, thank you for convening us. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.